Once upon a time, there was a place where I always felt safe. A small, old-fashioned movie theater where I could disappear into the dark and let the world fade away. But one rainy Friday night, that comfort was shattered forever. Because somewhere between the flicker of the projector and the hush of the crowd, I realized someone wasn't watching the movie. They were watching me. We moved into my grandparents' house in the spring of 2016, when they decided to downsize. I was 9 years old enough to remember every detail, but still young enough to feel like the world was bigger than it really was. My grandparents had built the place themselves back in the early 90s, and it sat out on the outskirts of a small, southern town, 5 acres of land, bordered by woods and open fields, the kind of property where you could go a whole day without hearing another car pass. On 2 sides, the southern fence line met the slow, muddy river that wound through the countryside like an old brown ribbon. In summer, the air smelled of wet earth and honeysuckle. In winter, it carried a sharpness that cut straight to the bone. Our only neighbors lived beyond the far fence, where the land sloped down toward that river bend. Their property was strange, shaped like a crooked triangle, with a house that looked like it was sinking into the ground, as if the soil had been trying to swallow it for decades. I learned later it had been the original farmhouse on this stretch of land, built sometime in the 1920s. Over the years, people had added on rooms here and there in no particular order. Looking at it was like looking at a patchwork quilt stitched by someone with no sense of pattern. Different roof heights, mismatched siding, windows that didn't line up. The siding itself was the color of old cigarette smoke, blotched with darker stains where moisture had gotten in. It had that soft, swollen look wood gets when it's been wet too long. Even on the sunniest day, the boards looked damp. The yard was worse. A tangle of bushes choked with vines, patches of waist-high grass, broken fountains sitting in pools of stagnant rainwater. Stone gnomes stood crooked in the weeds, some missing heads, some tipped over completely. Grocery bags fluttered from tree branches like strange pale flags. And right in the middle of the yard, a rusted lawnmower sat where it had clearly died mid-job years ago, grass still frozen in a half-cut swath around it. It was the kind of place that made you hold your breath when you walked past, even if you couldn't say exactly why. At the time, the house belonged to 2 elderly sisters, Violet and Agnes, and 3 kids, who were always somewhere around the property. Violet was the quieter of the 2, a small woman with thinning gray hair, always sitting on the porch in a faded green rocking chair, staring out at the trees as if she was waiting for something. She spoke in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. Agnes was different, taller, sharper in her movements, but she walked like her joints hurt with every step. She did most of the errands, driving a dented sedan that coughed and sputtered up the gravel road. Both women looked like they were in their 70s at least. The kids were their grandchildren. The boy, Liam, was my age and my grade at school. The other 2, twin girls named Allison and Kelsey, were the same age as my younger sister. Liam, I didn't like him. He was the kind of kid who didn't understand boundaries. We were in the same class, which meant people kept grouping us together, and he seemed to take that as permission to show up at my house whenever he wanted. No knocking, no texting. I'd be playing a game in my room, turn around, and he'd just be standing there. One afternoon, I looked out my bedroom window and saw him doing cannonballs into our pool. Another time, he walked into our kitchen, opened the fridge, and started eating a slice of leftover pizza with his hands, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. When we did hang out, it wasn't fun. He was obsessed with anime, which would have been fine if I'd watched any, but I hadn't. And he'd get mad when I didn't understand his references. Sometimes I caught him looking at me in this strange, almost calculating way, like he was imagining something violent. One time he chased me with a pair of sharp garden shears, swinging them around and laughing like it was a game. Another time, when we were standing on the old wooden bridge that crossed the creek near the back of our properties, he suddenly shoved me hard enough that I stumbled against the railing. He claimed it was a joke, but the way he smiled afterward told me it wasn't. The twins were different, quieter, almost invisible. Their clothes were always dirty, their hair unbrushed. They had trouble speaking clearly, their words coming out muffled and garbled like much younger children. They flinched at sudden movements, and there was a constant hunger in their eyes, the kind you recognize even if no one says it out loud. Their dad wasn't around much, in and out of jail. I heard which left them with their grandmother and their mother, Teresa. The first time I met Teresa was on one of those muggy summer afternoons when the air feels heavy enough to press down on your shoulders. I was walking along the fence line when I saw her crouched by the spigot at the edge of their property. She was tall, easily the tallest in the family, and heavy-set with long, thick, curly black hair and glasses that looked like they belonged in an old yearbook from the late 80s. She was dressed differently from the rest of them. Clean clothes, hair done, not a speck of dirt on her. She looked up when she saw me and her face lit up like she'd been expecting me. "Hey there," she called, her voice warm but strange, as if she was talking to someone she already knew. "Could you help me with this faucet? It's stuck." I walked over and gave it a twist. It moved easily. She gasped, clapped her hands together, and told me I was so strong, so lucky she'd run into me. It felt nice in that moment, like I was important. Then she tilted her head and said, "Did you know you have a third eye?" I blinked at her. "What?" Her smile widened. "Not a physical one, a spiritual one. It lets you see the truth." Before I could think of what to say, she was already walking back toward her house. She looked over her shoulder and told me to come with her. I followed her up onto the porch, and the smell hit me before the door even opened. Inside, it was worse. A heavy wave of rot and mildew and something else I couldn't name. The kind of smell that clings to the back of your throat. Trash bags split open along the walls. Plates of half-rotted food sat on the counters. Furniture stained so deeply I couldn't guess at its original color. I caught sight of dirty diapers stuffed behind the couch cushions. I hesitated, but Teresa's hand closed around my wrist, warm and firm, and she led me toward the stairs. Her bedroom was different. The air smelled faintly of rose water and something powdery like old perfume. The carpet was clean. Pink wallpaper lined the walls, and shelves of porcelain dolls watched from every corner. The furniture was old but gleaming, polished like she cared for it every day. She gestured for me to sit on a small cushioned stool in the corner, then walked to her vanity and slid open a drawer. From it, she pulled a silver tray, on which sat a black candle, a crystal, and a thick leather-bound book. My stomach tightened when I saw the pentagram on the cover. My parents were Catholic. I knew what that symbol meant. Then I started noticing more of them. On a jewelry box, etched into the mirror's frame, a faint carving peeking out from under the edge of the rug. I stood up so fast the stool tipped over. "Sorry, my mom wants me home," I blurted, and bolted for the door before she could say anything else. 3 years later, in 2019, Agnes had a heart attack and died right there in the living room. In front of the kids, I went to the funeral, a small run-down Baptist church on the edge of town. The family sat stone-faced, not a tear between them, except for one woman I didn't recognize, who sobbed so loudly it echoed through the sanctuary. No one spoke to her. That same year, Liam disappeared. Rumor was, he'd tried to hurt one of the twins and was sent to a psychiatric facility. My parents sat my sister and me down that night and told us, in no uncertain terms, that we were never to go near that family again. After that, the family slowly drifted away, leaving only Violet in that collapsing house. She died alone in 2020. When her estate went up for auction, one of my old elementary school teachers, Mrs. S., bought it with her husband. They tore down most of the place but kept the original, 1920s section, Teresa's old room. Mrs. S. invited us over to see the renovations. Everything looked new, bright paint, modern appliances. But when she took us upstairs, the air shifted. I knew we were in Teresa's room before she said a word. My skin prickled and I felt a sick, heavy pressure in my stomach. Even with the carpet replaced, I knew the pentagram was still there, hidden beneath. I left early, claiming a headache. 2 years later, Mrs. S. asked me to dog sit while she and her husband went out of town. I agreed. The first few nights were peaceful. But on the last night, the pug, Henry, planted himself at the base of the stairs and started barking. Muffin, the Shih Tzu, whimpered and backed away. Then came the thump from upstairs. Then another, louder. I didn't stay to investigate. I locked the door and walked home with the prickling sense that something had followed me. It's 2025 now. We hadn't heard from Teresa in years, until someone at school told me she'd seen her at a farmer's market in another town. She started some kind of religious group, calling herself a truth seer. Flyers have been showing up on bulletin boards. I don't trust her. I think she brought something into that house, and I don't think it ever left. Sometimes I still dream of her and of Liam, standing at the foot of my bed, staring silent, and every time I pass by that house, no matter how much paint or polish Mrs. S adds, I feel it watching me. That house remembers, and it never lets go. Story 2. Let's move on to the next story, which is Clayton. Story 2, Clayton. I'll never forget the day Clayton walked into my life. At first, he seemed like just another name in the roster at work, someone I might see in passing, exchange a polite nod with, and then never think about again. But there's something about some people, a certain way they occupy a room, or the way their eyes linger just a beat too long, that plants itself in your mind before you even realize it. Clayton was one of those people. It started in late summer. The air had that heavy, warm stillness that makes you slow down without realizing it. I'd been working at the store for a few months, long enough to know everyone's habits. Which cashier took extra smoke breaks? Who preferred unloading boxes in the back instead of dealing with customers? The little gossip loops that wound themselves through the aisles. Clayton arrived on a Wednesday. I remember because I'd been stocking the refrigerated section and the chill from the open case had numbed my arms, so I was moving slowly, methodically, letting my brain drift. When he walked in, he didn't introduce himself right away. He just moved along the edge of the store, scanning the shelves as if cataloging the entire layout in his head. When he finally reached me, he smiled, but it was tight. Like kind of smile you make when you're being forced to take a photo you don't want to be in. "You're the one who's been here a while, right?" he asked. I nodded, and we exchanged a few polite words about how things worked around here. He was soft-spoken, almost too soft, so I found myself leaning in slightly to catch his words. It struck me then, not his voice but his eyes. They didn't quite match the tone of his words. His voice was calm, polite, maybe even a little shy, but his eyes were sharp, watchful. At first I chalked it up to nerves. New job, new people, maybe he just needed time to loosen up. We've all been there. For the first few weeks he was quiet. Too quiet, actually. He never joined in when the others talked during breaks, but I'd catch him sitting just far enough away to listen. If someone laughed, he didn't laugh with them, but he would tilt his head slightly, as if filing away the sound. It wasn't until late September that the first odd moment happened. I'd been closing with him for the first time. The store was dim after hours, with only half the ceiling lights still on, casting long shadows across the aisles. I was in the back room counting out the till when I heard footsteps approach. I didn't look up right away. We all move around during close, but when I did, Clayton was just standing there, not moving, not speaking, just watching me. "Everything all right?" I asked, my voice coming out lighter than I intended, like I was trying to make the question sound casual. He smiled, but again it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just waiting." "For what?"
He didn't answer.
He just walked away. That night I found myself replaying it in my head. Waiting for what? The question stuck with me. After that, the small moments piled up. Sometimes I'd be stocking shelves and catch him standing at the end of the aisle, watching me until I noticed him. Sometimes he'd startle me by appearing from behind a display, his steps silent on the worn tile. Once I turned a corner in the back storage area and nearly ran into him, and he was just standing there, in the dim light, as if he'd been waiting for me to arrive. The thing about this kind of behavior is, at first you second-guess yourself. Maybe he's just awkward. Maybe he's not good at social cues. But after enough moments, that little voice in your head starts whispering, "This isn't normal." One night, after a particularly long shift, I walked out to the parking lot. It was nearly empty, just a few scattered cars under the humming streetlights. As I approached my car, I noticed a figure leaning against the hood. My stomach tightened before my brain even recognized him. "Clayton, you need a ride?" he asked. "No," I said quickly. "I've got my own car." He didn't move right away. He just stayed there looking at me in that same unreadable way. Then without a word, he stepped aside. The next week, he started showing up in places he didn't belong. I'd run to the bank on my lunch, break, and see him sitting in his car across the street. I'd be in line at the coffee shop near my apartment, and he'd walk in. Each time, he'd act surprised to see me. "What a coincidence," he'd say. But coincidences don't happen every other day. The worst was the night I stayed late for inventory. The store was quiet, empty except for the two of us and the hum of the refrigeration units. I was in the back checking counts when the lights flickered. I looked up, and in the moment before they came back on, I saw a shape in the doorway, tall still, watching me. When the light steadied, he was gone. That night I didn't sleep. I kept thinking about how quiet his footsteps were, how easily he seemed to appear without warning, and I realized something that made my skin crawl. I'd never actually seen him leave work at the end of a shift. He was just gone, and I never noticed the moment it happened. It was around then that I started locking my apartment door the moment I came inside. I'd glance out the window before going to bed, scanning the street for his car. Most nights there was nothing, but one night there it was and parked half a block down. I told myself I'd confront him the next day, but he didn't show up to work. In fact, he didn't show up again at all. No one seemed to know where he'd gone. Management just shrugged and said he must have quit. For a while I felt relieved. But relief doesn't erase memory. Even now, years later, I'll be walking home and think I see him in the crowd. I'll catch someone's reflection in a shop window and swear it's him, standing just far enough away to watch without being noticed. And sometimes, when I'm home alone, I'll feel it, that prickling sense between my shoulder blades, that awareness that somewhere in the quiet, someone might be waiting. Story 3 Gore. Let's move on to the next story, which is movie theater stalker. It started like any other Friday night. I'd had one of those weeks where every day felt twice as long as it should, and by the time I clocked out, I just wanted to sink into a dark theater and let my brain shut off for a couple of hours. I've always loved going to the movies alone. There's something freeing about not having to coordinate with anyone, not making small talk in the lobby, just buying a ticket, grabbing popcorn, and disappearing into the dark. The theater I usually go to is an older one, not one of those massive multiplexes with neon lights and 20 screens. This place has 6 theaters, all slightly run down but in a charming way. The carpet smells faintly like stale butter, and the poster frames in the lobby still have scratches from years ago. I've been going there since I was a kid, so it feels safe, familiar. It was drizzling that night, just enough to make the streets look slick and reflective under the streetlights. The parking lot wasn't crowded, maybe a dozen cars at most. I remember thinking how perfect it was, no crowds, no chatter, just a quiet evening for myself. Inside, the lobby was nearly empty. A young guy at the ticket booth barely looked up when I asked for a ticket to the late showing of a thriller I'd been meaning to see. I bought a small popcorn and a soda, though of course the soda cup was the size of my head, and headed to Theater 4. That's when I first noticed him. He was leaning against the wall near the hallway to the theaters, hood up, hands in his pockets. I probably wouldn't have thought much about it, except he wasn't looking at his phone or glancing around like most people waiting for someone. He was staring directly at me. I did what most people do, pretended I didn't notice and kept walking. But even after I handed my ticket to the usher and turned down the hallway, I could feel it, that weird, almost physical sensation of someone's eyes burning into the back of your neck. Inside Theater 4, the lights were still on low for seating. Only a handful of people were scattered around. I like sitting about 2/3 of the way back near the aisle, so I picked my spot and set my drink and popcorn down. As I shrugged off my jacket, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. It was him, the guy from the hallway. He stepped inside, scanned the room quickly, and then sat down 2 rows behind me, not directly behind, but close enough that I could hear the faint rustle of his jacket when he settled in. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just here to see the same movie. It's not like I owned the theater. Still, something about the way he moved, deliberate, almost rehearsed, made my stomach tighten. The previews started and I tried to focus. Every now and then, though, I'd glance slightly to the side and catch the shadow of his head in my peripheral vision. He wasn't shifting in his seat like most people do, adjusting for comfort. He was still, too still. When the movie began, I got drawn in for a while, but about 30 minutes in, I went to grab a sip of soda and froze. He had moved. Not a lot, maybe 1 seat over, but enough that he was now directly behind me, just 1 row back. I didn't hear him move. No footsteps, no creak of the seat, but he was there, closer. I kept my eyes on the screen, but my mind was racing. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe the theater's layout made the seats feel closer than they were. I told myself to relax, focus on the movie. But then I heard it. A faint inhale. Not a cough, not a sigh. Just breathing. Steady, slow. It wasn't loud. but in the quiet moments of the film I could hear it behind me. I shifted slightly in my seat, leaning forward to create a bit of distance. I didn't want to turn around and make it obvious I was aware. That might escalate something. An hour into the film, I decided I'd get up for a bathroom break just to create space. I grabbed my soda, stood, and walked down the aisle toward the exit. My plan was to linger in the lobby for a few minutes, maybe even change seats when I came back. When I reached the hallway outside, I glanced back through the small window in the theater door. He was standing, not watching the screen, not stretching, just standing in the aisle facing the door. I turned away quickly and walked to the restroom, my heart pounding. I stayed in there for longer than necessary, staring at the pale fluorescent light on the tiles, trying to decide if I should just leave. But my bag was still in my seat, and something in me didn't want to feel chased out of a public place. When I returned, he wasn't in the aisle. For a second, I thought maybe he'd left, but when I sat down again, I felt it, that same pressure at the back of my neck. He was behind me again. The last 20 minutes of the movie were torture. My brain barely registered the plot. Every sound, every rustle, every shift in the seat was amplified. When the credits finally rolled, I stayed seated, pretending to check my phone. Most people filed out quickly, but not him. He stayed just like me, waiting. Eventually, I stood and walked up the aisle toward the exit. I could hear him following, not too close, but close enough that I could tell he matched my pace. Out in the hallway, I moved toward the lobby. But instead of heading to the parking lot, I ducked into the restroom again. I stood inside, counting seconds. 2 minutes passed. 3. When I finally stepped back into the lobby, he was leaning against the wall by the exit doors, just watching. I didn't even pretend to be casual. I walked straight to the concession stand, where a worker was wiping down the counter. I leaned in and said quietly but firmly, "There's a man following me. He's outside the door." The kid's eyes widened. "Do you want me to call someone?" "Yes, please." He disappeared into the back. I stayed by the counter, not looking toward the doors. I could still feel him there, though. After a couple of minutes, the manager came out. A heavy-set man in his 50s with a walkie-talkie clipped to his belt. He glanced toward the exit, then back at me. "Stay here," he said, and walked toward the doors. I didn't hear what was said, but when the manager came back, he told me the man had left. No explanation, no ticket stub. Just gone. I asked if someone could walk me to my car. The manager nodded, and one of the ushers, a tall kid with an anxious expression, accompanied me. The rain had stopped, but the parking lot felt too quiet, too open. I half expected to see him standing somewhere in the shadows, but he wasn't there. My car was the only one in my row. I unlocked it quickly, got in, and locked the doors. As I pulled out, I checked my mirrors over and over. No cars followed me. No hooded figure appeared. But even now, I can still feel that moment, sitting in the theater, the glow of the screen washing over me and the quiet, steady sound of someone's breathing just behind my ear. I still don't know who he was or why he followed me. Maybe he chose me at random. Maybe he'd been watching me for a lot longer than that night. But every time I step into a theater now, I find myself glancing over my shoulder, listening for that slow, steady breathing in the dark. If this story made you feel that same chill down your spine, remember, the next time you're sitting alone in a dimly lit place, someone might be sitting just a little too close. And if you think you're safe, you're not.